I'm Portia Parker Griffin, and I want to welcome you to the Career 101 podcast, a place for ambitious professionals and seasoned executives who want an edge in their career. We're talking about all of the things you were never taught or told when it comes to career growth, development, and change. Now, let's get into it. Today, we are talking about the multi-generational workforce with Dr. Carol Parker Walsh. Dr. Carol Parker Walsh is an expert in transformative leadership and human development, recognized with multiple awards for her profound impact. As the CEO and founder of Carol Parker Walsh Consulting Group, her firm specializes in leadership development and talent optimization, partnering with leading organizations to cultivate a culture that accelerates leadership capabilities to drive organizational success. With an extensive and diverse background spanning 3 decades as an employment attorney, consultant, researcher, brand strategist, and senior leader, Dr. Parker Walsh offers unparalleled insights for guiding leaders and organizations. Her peers have recognized her as a TEDx speaker, 3-time Amazon bestselling author and member of the Forbes Coaches Council, Forbes Black, Newsweek Expert Forum, and Entrepreneurs Leadership Network. Her podcast, The Midlife Career Rebel, is widely acclaimed for its insightful content. Hi, Dr. Carol. How are you today?
I am fabulous. How are you?
I am doing amazing, and I am thrilled to have you with us to discuss the multi-generational workforce. But first, we want to know a little more about you.
Yeah.
About 7-year-old Carol.
Let's see. 7-year-old Carol was defiant, adventurous, definitely a risk taker, very imaginative, but spoiled. At that time, I was the baby of the family. It was another 3 years before that status was no longer my own. But yeah, I was a rambunctious little one.
Right. So what did you want to be when you grew up?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were so many things I wanted to be. I thought I wanted to be a doctor. But I think that came later on. I thought I wanted to be an obstetrician or gynecologist, somebody who delivered babies. That I thought would be exciting to do until I got old enough to take a class in college. And we took anatomy physiology, and the whole idea of all of that turned me completely off. Not to mention the fact that blood and bodily fluids are not my favorite things to be exposed. So that shifted for me pretty quickly after that.
I get it. I wanted to be a vet for a while until the blood and bodily fluids came in.
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it all seems on TV. The baby just comes, right?
Yeah,
But yeah, there's a whole lot more in between.
exactly. So, what was your first job?
My very first job that I was paid for, I was a summer counselor I went to Catholic schools all of my life. And so the school that I went to, elementary school, when we were in high school, a lot of us came back and we were able to work as counselors for the summer for the kids that were in kind of the summer program that they had. And that was my first paying gig.
Very cool. Very cool. Love summer camp.
Yes, yes.
So, tell us about some highlights or pivotal moments in your career before you started your own business.
Wow, that's a great question. I I think of the highlights that I had in my career that were either hard or challenging, but had so much emotion or success behind it. So for me, it was like when I conducted my first trial and being able to voir dire and pull a jury together and to present. And I remember that before I walked in the courtroom, I vomited. I was so nervous and so sick to my stomach. But once I was able to get in the flow of it, that was really exciting. So that was one of the times. I think the first time I facilitated a retreat for a group of leaders was nerve-wracking, but so exciting to be able to do. The first time I published something and saw my name underneath some work that I had created. Those were some of the I mean, I've had different interesting career journey, but those were some of the pieces that I always will remember that really stand out for me.
Yeah, those are definitely some pivotal moments. What was your first
Yeah.
about? I guess it was employment law related.
It was a sexual harassment case that was very challenging because at the time that I was practicing, we're talking in the 90s, and this was a new kind of frontier for a lot of employment firms because it was post like the Anita Hill hearings and when Clarence Thomas was put on the Supreme Court. And so it was something that women just often didn't speak up about because they thought they wouldn't be believed or heard or really have any kind of support. So it was pretty exciting to be able to be part of that process.
I bet.
Yeah.
You have a very interesting and inspiring background. What motivated you to start your own business?
That's a great question. My father always had an entrepreneurial spirit, and he would try throughout his career. He always had a job. He was in the military, and then he worked for the post office and became a postmaster. But all throughout his career, he always talked about entrepreneurialism and would tell us as children, like, there's nothing like owning your own and having your own and really building your own business as opposed to always working for somebody else. But even though he always said that, we always watched him work, and we always had a very strong ethic. We always worked as well, but he passed in 2012, and I started my business in 2014. And in that time I was right on the precipice of turning 50. So I was in this, like, pivotal moment and shift in my life, and I was at a place in my career where I said, "You know what? I think I wanna do this. I think I really wanna focus in on the type of work that I wanna do and make the impact that I wanna make." And in a lot of ways, it was in memory and in honor of my father. I liked his voice was just getting louder and louder around, "Do it, go for it." He used to always ask a question whenever I got yet another degree, joke that I'm overeducated, but he would always ask me, "What are you gonna do with it? What are you gonna do with it?" And I think in his way, it was like, "You have so much opportunity available to you now because you have this education. So what are you gonna do with it? How are you gonna use it?" And that's what was going through my head for those years after he passed before I started my business was, "What can you do with it? What are you gonna do with it?" And that's really what prompted me to hang out my shingle and start my business.
I am so glad that you did. And I'm extremely happy to speak with you today because some of your work focuses on the multi generational workforce. And a lot of our listeners know that's a focus of our business and some of our B2B work with companies and organizations directly. Clients often ask me about the differences between the various generations in the workforce. So, for those who don't know, Dr. Carroll, can you explain the main generations in the workforce today?
Yeah, we it's interesting, we have about 6 of them at play, but about 5 of them in the workplace. So, we still have hanging on our silent traditional generation that is and the numbers of the age ranges obvious in a lot of ways are somewhat arbitrary and they may differ, but, for the ones that I follow, it's usually from, like, 25 to 45. We have the silent traditional generation. These are the generation that grew up in a time where authority was important, where you followed hierarchy, where you respected leadership. You got on a job, you stayed there until you died, until they carried you away. So, in terms of the deep rooted work ethic that we have around how you show up to work and your commitment to work and your obligation and dedication to the workplace comes through that generation. And then following that, from about 46 to 64, we have the baby boomer generation, which was at one point the largest generation that came out of the boom from World War II. This generation was the generation that continued that tradition. They established, I jokingly call the 80-hour work week, right? Because it was all about achievement and competition and success and reaching those goals and getting that corner office and grabbing that title. And this generation really pushed a lot of the workplace policies that we're still continuing or struggling, I should say, with today. really came out of that generation. And even though right now they're at retirement age, we have about 10,000 boomers ready to retire almost daily. They're living longer, they're healthier, and they're staying more present in the workplace. And it's interesting. I want to say about the silent generations, just go back to that right quickly, is that we see them mostly in education and politics. While they, depending on the industry, you may see some silent generation, but they're predominantly situated in politics and in education. And then after the boomer generation, we talked about them, comes Gen Xers, and they range about 65 to 80, right? 65 to 80. And this was the sandwich generation, the smallest generation that we had. They came up in a time where they had a distrust for government and organizations. They watched a president resign in disgrace, right? We see Nixon that came out of office. They were very individualistic because the birth control pill came about, divorce rates were high, women were going into the workforce, so they were left alone as latchkey kids. And they had to really develop their own sense of family and community and independence. And while they too follow some of those traditional ideas of work of how you are in the workplace, they were one of the first generations that started piloting this idea of balance and having value in what you do and wanting not to be workaholics like they witnessed generations beforehand. And then following after them are our millennials that came around, which is roughly about 1981 to 1996, 97. And this particular population is the digital population, right? So they grew up with electronics, with the internet, and things of that nature. So they have a little bit more savvy around how to operate in the digital world, a little bit more excited about that. They definitely were moving into champions, having watched their parents be workaholics in terms of balance and taking care of themselves and having that kind of self-care mantra within the workplace. And we see a lot of the millennials moving into leadership. In fact, they are currently the largest generation in the workplace. And by 2025, we're definitely going to be about 75% of the workplace that, we're seeing right now. So this is a very big, strong population that is right now poised and positioned to move into leadership and start to shift and turn how we are starting to see how we work in the generations. And following them, we have our Gen Z, which again, digital natives. This is a generation that was starting to be born around 1998 to about 2012. And this generation is one that has a sense of confidence. They were the one that people often call entitled. They're the generation that people say got a participation ribbon for everything. But they are one that are very much into diversity. They're very much into authenticity. They're the generation because they grew up in a global community. They have a respect for differences and different cultures and different backgrounds. They have a respect for pronouns, different pronouns and identity, and are a generation that is really pushing the envelope around this idea of binary and non-binary ways of showing up in the world. And so they're a generation that's coming into the workplace as well. And depending on their age, if they're earlier born in 2012, we see them coming into starting into some entry level positions that are going to be ultimately that next generation moving forward. And then the final generation that we're actually in the midst of right now are what's called Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is born around 2013 and is anticipated that generation will go to about 2028. And this is the first generation we have that's completely born in the 21st century. It's the first generation that will be 52% non-white. It not only will respect diversity, but will be the most diverse generation that we will have ever seen. So when we look at the millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha, some also call them, what's the word? Polars, generation polars, because they're growing up in a very polarized society right now. This is gonna be a fascinating generation to watch in terms of what they're going to, do and how they're gonna shift the workplace. So, this is why we're seeing conversations around remote work and healthcare, mental health, and so on and so forth, which I guess we'll get into, but those are the generations that we are working with right now in the workplace.
Yeah, and thank you for giving us that overview. I think that helps a lot of people who aren't necessarily familiar with the generations to have an idea of who they are. In my years as a coach and consultant, I've seen a variety of issues come up among people of different generations at work.
Mm.
What's the most common challenges you've seen among generations in the workplace?
Yeah, the biggest challenge is the caveat that I always give to people when we talk about generations is that one, generations are not monolithic groups. And so even though people may be born in a particular generation, a lot of it depends on their socioeconomic, their culture, their background, their religion, their family upbringing. There's so many influences that somebody may not quote unquote present as a particular generational stereotype. And so it's really important that we not overlay this idea that because you're in this generation, you will automatically behave in a certain way. So these assumptions that we make around generations is one of the sources of conflict. In addition to the idea that every generation thinks they're the best generation. And so what we tend to do is look at what we focus on is what we consider to be the flaws of the other generation or the challenges of the other generation. That immediately puts us at a conflict because we're making these assumptions and are assuming that people are going to operate in a way of being. And so that really causes a charged dialogue and charged communication between them because I was actually I did a talk on this the other day, and we had people in the audience, and I had my millennials say, "Why can't boomers listen?" And the boomers say, "Why do the millennials always think they know everything?" And people actually raised their hand, and it was a perfect example of these generalizations that we enter into conversations with, and then we make assumptions and we start operating on those assumptions, and that's what causes a lot of the conflict. And it's so important for us if we're going to be able to function better generationally is that we start looking at what generations bring to the table as opposed to operating from this assumption that it's a problem because these generations aren't operating in the same way that we think a generation should operate.
You made a lot of great points, Dr. Carol. I remember when I first started incorporating talking about generational diversity and different generations in the workforce into our business. And I'm a millennial, as many people know. And the stereotypes were so strong, and they still are, but there would be a lot of millennials that would tell me, I'm a millennial and I don't even want to be called a millennial because people assume we're lazy. They
Yes.
attribute all these negative things to us. So, to your point about the stereotypes, those are definitely real. And then also your point about thinking about their generation is the best. I will never forget one of the first few talks I did at a national conference about generations. And one of the gentlemen, he was a baby boomer, he said, "Oh," and this was probably about 2015 ish. So almost 10 years ago now. And he said, "Oh, millennials, we just don't hire those millennials because they quit all the time." And I just, sir, that is not a sound business strategy or a way to think about your succession plan. To your point about thinking their generation is the best or having some resistance around
Yes.
differences, that can definitely come up. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome. It is so problematic, and it hurts my heart when I hear people say that. But that is definitely the idea that millennials or Gen Zs they have a 2 to 5 year lifespan. And what I always and it's only because of this idea the boomers have that it's a work ethic. You stay there, you work there, you stay there, you work hard. It doesn't matter if you enjoy it. Doesn't matter if you're valued. Doesn't matter if you're respected. Doesn't matter if you're getting paid. Like all of that doesn't matter is that you have a job and you work the job. Whereas what millennial generations are bringing to the table is that no, the reason I'm leaving is because you're not walking your values. You're not supporting my development. You're not creating an environment where I feel safe and acknowledged. I'm not doing work where I feel valued or am being valued for the work that I'm putting forth. And so so I'm a boomer, and what I always try to share with my boomer colleagues is that what we're trying to do is fit these round pegs in a square hole. And what we have to start thinking about is how to not make the whole square, but how to soften the edges so that we are thinking about how to create an environment and a culture that supports the people that are there versus trying to make them fit into the culture that we created that is no longer operating in the current landscape of work and definitely not in the future of work.
An amazing point, Dr. Carol, that some of our listeners might need to pause that again. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Many of the leaders that we work with don't feel like they know how to start the conversation around generational diversity. How do you recommend a leader start that conversation? The Career 101 podcast is brought to you by Fly High Coaching, where we help our clients soar to their full potential. Executives and leaders are setting out to achieve their company goals, but without the right support, it can be difficult, if not impossible. Employee performance, productivity, and company culture all affect organizational revenue and profits. We offer customized consulting, coaching, and training solutions and can serve as your external talent development partner. Check us out on our website, fly-highcoaching.com.
Yeah, I think I'm always a proponent of starting with self before we go external. And so I think it's important to just really understand both the pros and cons of how you see yourself in your generation and to ask yourself questions about if I were starting in my career today, or if I was moving in the landscape and the work the way it is today, would I want to work this way? I do a lot of work with senior leader and executives and people who have been in the workplace for 20 and 30 years. And what I often hear is their own discontent with how things have happened in their career, or how they may have been treated in their career, or how their voice wasn't heard, or how they weren't able to have certain opportunities, or how the political game disadvantage them, or and on. And so I asked them to start with yourself. And if you were coming in today, what would you like to have? And how does that differ from let go of the idea what you think it should be, but think about what it would mean for you. So to start with that individual question, and then to start operating and finding the common ground across generations and start and communicating from there and start talking about where we have common ground. How do we feel about collaboration, right? How do you view that? How does the other generation view it? How do we find common ground? Looking at what the other generations bring to the table. What are some of the advantages that come from being in those generations, right? So, from my perspective, if we take an appreciative approach, um, from not only from for ourselves, but for the other generations in which we're trying to engage with, it would allow us to start to have something to build upon, as opposed to going at it from a more scarcity perspective that I think we need to go. But I'm always an advocate first for a leader to gain some deeper self awareness so that you can be more reflective in your conversations with someone else, as opposed to, and coming from a place of curiosity, as opposed to coming from this place of, I know exactly what's right, and what I think is what's right is what needs to happen. Those are the kind of two steps that I would always suggest for a leader.
I think those are great. Really starting with yourself, taking that appreciative approach and coming from that perspective of curiosity. And I think this is a great segue. You're starting to answer where I want to go. But what are some other tips or recommendations that you would give teams dealing with conflict that might stem from generational differences?
Yeah, that's really a great question too. When you're doing kind of generational training, I think it can be really fun. I often put generations, group them together and let them talk to each other and come up with their mantras and things of that nature. It can be really a fun thing to see the perspective of the other generation. But I think also what's really important from a team dynamic is not to just play with the stereotypes, or for people to talk about their experiences growing up in the time that they grew up, so that we can start to connect to people on a human level and not just at that generational level, right? Because sometimes it's fun to talk about, I grew up with eight-track tapes and another generation, what's an eight-track? What is that? And how somebody else went to school, or how they walked to school and somebody else was chauffeured every day, or so some of those things can be playful and fun to talk about. But I think when we start getting at a deeper level about what my experiences were as I grew up, then we start to uncover how we're showing up as a team member, right? So if my experiences at the time and what I was influenced by at that time is really informing the way that I communicate or don't communicate well, or why I may be more defensive or not defensive. or why I may feel like I'm being a team player, why I may be asking you 50 questions is because I'm trying to build collaboration and teamwork. It's not because I don't trust myself or know what I'm doing. It's just that I like to work in community as opposed to individualistic. So if we understand some of these undertones that are operating at this kind of surface level, I think it gives us more insight to gain a deeper understanding of how we can co-function as a team as opposed to operating in silos individually or again having these assumptions that we have. I know people who are millennials that are like, I don't know digital stuff. Stop asking me how something works technologically. I don't know. And I know some boomers who are like, I got it. I could totally handle that because it's a forte. So we have to, again, lay down the kind of stereotypical assumptions and start having these deeper conversations to understand experiences and how those experiences have informed how we show up so we can start really operating at that team level in a better way.
Another topic that comes up a lot with our clients is that a leader might have direct reports that are older than them and of a different generation. What do you
Yeah,
think that leaders do to be more effective when leading people older than them?
that is a fabulous that comes up quite a bit. In fact, I'm actually coaching some leaders in that regard. Is understanding I think one of the things is when you understand how generations are, like, if you can maybe start with some of the if you're coaching, a boomer or you have a boomer on your team and you're a millennial or a Gen Z, to understand that they do like authority and hierarchy, and they are competitive and like to win and have achievements. Again, generalization. So if you understand that basic generalization and then start to ask some independent questions about how do you like to be motivated? How do you like to be rewarded? How do you like to feel acknowledged as a member of this team? It gives you not only some general ideas, but some individual work that you can do. But I also believe that from a millennial perspective, while again, stereotypically they tend to be more collaborative, they need to maybe be a little bit more authoritative, right? There needs to be a little, because again, if they're managing a boomer who respects that, then they need to own their authority. And I think sometimes what happens is that the younger generation looks at the older one thinking, I need to be respectful because they're older and they may not show up in their power and authority as a leader. And on the other hand, I know sometimes boomers show up like, you could be my child or grandchild, so you need to respect me. And so we need to have that conversation and acknowledge maybe that's even existing. But as the younger leader, you need to understand how to own your authority and how to step into your power, not in a dictative way, but in a way that elicits respect from the people that you're leading. Right. And so when you break it down into role and responsibility and let go of the age, then just step into the role and responsibility and remind the people on your team what their roles and responsibilities are and hold people accountable and make sure that you're leading in accordance with what your team needs from you as a leader. So that's usually and I know it's a very general kind of advice because every situation I think is different depending on how many people you have on your team or what some of the challenges or the pushbacks that you may be having if you're leading somebody younger or older than you. But that to me is one of if you break things down to understanding roles, responsibilities, stepping into your authority, and allowing the other person to be able to voice and express any concerns or challenges that they're having, and then creating a leadership relationship that makes sense for you and your team. That's the best way that I would suggest going about it.
I think all of that is great information for people to know. So, Dr. Carol, you talk about leadership shifts within generations. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, we're in the middle of a leadership shift right now when it comes to, as I said, right now, more CEOs and leaders are in the Gen X category, but we're seeing more and more millennials that are in the workplace, which means that how we are leading is going to have to shift in terms of things like hybrid work and remote work. These kind of old principles of the workplace that we've been holding on to, the 9 to 5 work, showing up every day, putting in the extra hours, not having what I call career life alignment more so than balance, but having this alignment between how you live your life and how you do your work. All of those are no longer kind of hypotheticals that leaders are going to maybe explore or think to explore. but they're realities that they're going to have conversations about. And not through the lens of how they've done it, but through the lens of where we're moving and at the workforce that we have coming ahead of ourselves. What do they need in order to be sustainable and to stay? So there is succession planning. So that someone is there beyond 2 to 5 or 6 years, but they actually are feeling a commitment to be able to work in that organization because they feel valued and heard. So what I mean by the leadership shift is that because of the shifting populations that are coming in the workplace, that the way that we do leadership is going to have to change. It absolutely has to change. This industrial age, dehumanized approach to just work as opposed to focusing on the workers and having a more human-centric approach that we need to start having today, that has going to it has to change. Like I said, next year, 75% of the workforce are gonna be millennials, and if you don't wanna keep spending hundreds of thousands of dollars recruiting and hiring because your retention rates are so high, then you're going to have to see that this is not just that this is the business case, that it's not the revenue is tied to how you are managing your human capital and how you are leading that next generation.
Great information. So, Dr. Carol, tell us more about your business.
Yeah, so we are a leadership development, executive coaching, and talent optimization firm, and we prioritize ourselves. We focus on a methodology that I call people forward innovation. And what we know is at the intersection of culture, team, and leader, people are squarely in the middle of it. And in order for organizations to have greater engagement, to have greater retention and profitability, that at those levels, they have to center a people forward innovative solution. And so that's what we do with organizations. So we do that through executive coaching of leaders and emerging leaders. We create programs for next gen leaders to be able to help them to be able to be successful in that regard. And we also do work group and team development to make sure that teams are functioning effectively and cross collaboratively so that they're able to move business agenda forward. And we also do some culture change work. And one of the principles that I use a lot is psychological safety. So we is grounded in Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety. And so we do a lot of that to try to help create cultures in which it's safe for these type of conversations and changes to take place within organizations.
It sounds like amazing work, and we'll be providing a link to your website and other social channels in our show notes so people can find you online. But what is the best way for someone to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think I'm always on LinkedIn. So if you want to find and connect with me on LinkedIn, please come check me out there. But if you start at my website, that's a great place to start because all of the other links are right there to be found to find some of the, we do articles on LinkedIn as well as a very active blog. And so we are always trying to stay at the cutting edge of the future of work and make sure that information is readily available that really help leaders excel and operate at their highest level.
Perfect. So now I want to ask you our final question that I ask all of our guests. How do you think executives or professionals can get a positive edge in their career?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. I think understanding the impact that you wanna make in the world, I think it's an important thing that we reconnect to a value-driven proposition on the work that we do, and understanding how you authentically bring something uniquely to the table that supports that impact, because that's the differentiation that you bring. And so to advance in your career, to advance in your leadership, to make an impact in the world, you want to know what that is, how to articulate that, and how to demonstrate that both in your digital footprint as well as in the work that you do in the world. Those are the 2 things I would recommend.
Those are some great things. And Dr. Carol, you've shared a lot of insights with us today, and I'm sure that our listeners can use it to be more confident in their careers. We appreciate you being with us.
Fabulous conversation. Thank you.
This episode was brought to you by the Bravebird Career Alliance, the go to membership designed for seasoned executives and ambitious professionals with everything you need for career planning, strategy, training, and support. Thank you again for listening to the Career 101 podcast. I hope you have at least one key takeaway that you can use in your own career. If you enjoyed hanging out with us, please rate, subscribe, and share this podcast. Until next time, here's to your success.